appreciate. It's been fun. Okay, Andrew.
So yeah, everyone's already said it. Kenny's already said it a lot, but thank you everybody for coming. I love open spaces. It's like my favorite way of doing conferences, or not doing conferences, as the case may be. So Diana and I are going to kick off with a half-hour session, which we originally wrote for O'Reilly, but that was only for people on the O'Reilly platform. So we wanted to share it widely, and we thought this would be an awesome way of doing it. So what we're going to do in the next 30 minutes, and then we'll get out of the way for everyone to self-organize, is what we wanted to do is talk about things that were painful, and we wanted to talk about things that were hard, because we thought pain and stuff that's hard is good for an open space. So what we're going to talk about in the next 30 minutes is things we're supposed to do when we do software architecture. We're going to talk about the way we're supposed to do them. And Diana and I are going to open the space up a little bit by being honest about what, for us at least, isn't working. Or even things that do work, but to be to be honest, are emotionally awful, because they're really hard for on people's emotions, and then they don't work. So Diana, do you want to kick us off with some of your experiences first?
Yes. So Andrew and I have been on a bit of a journey together over the last year or so, and so I've really learned a lot from our experiences and from organizing this, and especially because I work predominantly in knowledge systems. So I have, my experience is in the context that I work. And over the last 10 years, my work has shifted from extending a single code base, from basically building the monoliths on the internet, to architecting and building systems of software, interrelated platforms made up of multiple types of software. And so this has required an ever expanding skill set. And I used to call myself a full stack developer, which is hysterical to me now. Like, I'm not even know what full stack would mean. But in order to keep up with these modernizing demands, everyone I work with wants a digital transformation. Like that has been the big key. And so I've architected some big transformations and had some fun and some wins. And I've also experienced like massively frustrating failures, and often within the exact same initiative. Two initiatives ended with every C-level involved being gone by the end. And there's a lot of drama in tech. So obviously, I wanted to understand why. What are the patterns? What helps and what hinders us? And where are the leverage points? And it was never obvious stuff. So the answer varies from situation to situation. But so far, it's never been, we don't know enough about Kubernetes, right? So there's one iceberg, though, that we kept hitting. And that is that as we moved from building software to systems of interrelated software, we didn't move from software thinking to systems thinking. So we don't think in systems. We aren't trained to or set up for it or supported by thinking, communicating, designing, and delivering as relational complexity increases. And it isn't advanced engineering. It's a different skill set. And we're trained to linearize, simplify, and make concrete. So organizations can deliver endless change, in my experience, inside the current paradigm. But what happens when the paradigm shifts? That's what transformation is. And in my world, the paradigms are shifting all over the place, and transformation requires transformation. You can't simply do what Netflix does. So we're in the midst of a new physics and re-exploring space-time with software.
So thanks, Dana. You just mentioned the shift to systems, and as Trond will no doubt remind us when we go into the open space, systems aren't just software-based, right? There are human systems which are involved in the building and running of all of this. And in my experience, being in the middle of some of these or many of these older school human systems and struggling to build software sucks. How come? Well, a lot lies in how we see our role as people who do architecture, not necessarily the writing of the code, but the architecting and the designing of the overall systems. In my experience, at least, things like the memes of the ivory tower and the PowerPoint architect still hold far more than the kernel of truth for many of the clients where I work at, because I'm a consultant. And in the past, I'd been expected, perhaps unconsciously, to play roles which tended towards those cliches. So because I work for ThoughtWorks, I tried as hard as I could to avoid falling into them. I tried to be, for example, a benevolent review board member, or more frequently these days, break out of them as a hands-on architect, right? Everybody wants to be a hands-on architect, down at the code face with teams. But that's another meme, right? We're still following kind of mimetic ways of doing things. And either way, I was still feeling in the current systems, the current socio-technical systems, that I was a drag on progress, or worse than that, I was a bottleneck. Now, to be super clear, we all agree, I'm sure, that we need good software and good systems architectures, because why else would we all be kind of involved in software? We need domain-aligned, team decoupling, cohesiveness-driving, constantly evolving. Good architecture has a massive positive impact. But as I worked alongside more and more of my ThoughtWorks colleagues who were trying their hardest to build the systems and make teams around them faster and more autonomous, because that's what everybody's doing these days, what I kept doing to nurture the overall architectures, the sum of all of the parts, wasn't working. Review boards and sign-offs and dedicated architecture and straightjacketing frameworks wasn't working. And the other alternative, close pairing, moving from autonomous team to autonomous team, trying to do all the required design in all the right places, wasn't working either. And my fear of being part of all of this for client after client was giving me nightmares. Not necessarily Henry Fuseli's famous picture of a nightmare, but it was pretty similar. There was a horse involved in the nightmare. But what I did, because I'm a software architect and engineer, what I realized after a while, I literally had some of these nightmares, I distilled them down to their essence. And the root of them, for me anyway, was the way I'd been making and taking and communicating architectural decisions. Specifically, there were three things. Number one, I was making decisions slowly. I was a blocker. I was getting in the way of teams who were otherwise fast. Number two, I was making bad decisions. Other people would have made better architectural decisions. And number three, I was communicating those decisions to teams badly. So they were good decisions, but the teams didn't understand what I meant. And it made me wonder, was there another way of doing all of this?
So that question, is there another way? I feel like that is why we're here, right? To continuously try and understand that. And so at every event that I've attended, in every organization or team I've been part of, there's endless debate about what is architecture. And we're very opinionated on this subject. And what do we mean by that word? And more importantly, to my mind, who gets to define it? And our answers can vary so much that we might all be here describing very different skill sets and expectations and roles with the same word. So today we aren't going to concretely define what that word means, because it depends, right? What does the situation need? It depends on the circumstances. And I would argue that any one definition applied to all circumstances would be bad architecture. So the labels don't matter nearly as much as impact, right? So what does matter in architecture is being able to figure out what it depends on, right? And to help us to do that, we're going to talk about architecture as a practice. And we're going to talk about it as a practice of facilitating thinking. So in my experience, that's 80% of the work, right? Everyone benefits from becoming better at thinking well together, regardless of what we name our roles. And every system is only as good as our ability to facilitate systemic thinking or systems thinking. And so from this point of view, architecture is a technology-agnostic skill set, right? You practice it regardless of which tools or programming languages you work with. And if your background is like mine, you're not using the same tools and programming languages you were like 3 years ago, right? So this, I think, is the stuckiest of the stuck place, or at least it has been for me, is that we want architecture to be advanced software engineering. And in a lot of places, it's a promotion along the engineering track. And in some ways it is. You have to actually have the skills with the tools in order to be able to know what to do with them. But in some critical ways, it's potentially a different skill set entirely. So the practice of nonlinear thinking, of systems approaches, which includes things like self-awareness and metacognition, thinking about thinking, collective reasoning and communication skills, pattern design and pattern thinking, and asynchronous approaches to delivering value.
So while you think about that, I want to introduce another topic to help you think about, or to prompt your thinking as well. So as Diana pointed out, software and tech in general is moving incredibly fast, and the speed of that change is accelerating. The expectations of our users, the forces in the market are changing rapidly too. And as I mentioned earlier, the dynamics of teams building and running these systems are complex also, right? We can blame people like Manuel Pais and Matt Skelton for things like that. Whether we like it or not, our work and our architectures are subject to these forces. And to me, the only way to navigate this ever-changing landscape is to acknowledge it, but more than that, to optimize for it. How? What I ended up doing is riding or attempting to ride the many feedback loops. The way I work aims to maximize those loops, right? To ride on top of them. So to do that, I try and do three things. Number one, I collaboratively design, which has led me to things like DDD, which allows me to harvest widely the existing knowledge and insights from across teams and systems. Step two, I empower. I try as much as I can to get out of the way as the one sole true architect and work with teams and give them as much space to make their own decisions. And number three, I focus on running that software. And by running the software, we gather even more feedback from the users and the runtimes themselves. But not only those three things, what I do is I optimize for doing this loop over and over again as much as possible, feeding everything that we learn and all of us that learn it back into future iterations.
And so, through these very similar processes, Andrew and I have had really different experiences. I think most of us would discover that there are a lot of differences in our situations and experiences, and we use different vocabulary to describe it. And this is, I think, where we are as a community, is developing that vocabulary so that we can begin to use words and mean the same thing when we do. But we discover we have far more in common than we do differences. And in our case today, there's one key point that we really want to share, and that is that architecture practice is a solitary intra-group and intergroup activity. That how we think alone, together, and as an organization about things that create and is what creates and crafts a systems architecture, right? How we think alone, together, and as an organization about things is how we create architecture. And so the things I mean when we're thinking about architecture are things like boundaries, relationships, events, choreography, especially time and space, the impact of socio-technical systems, patterns, strategic technology decision-making, managing complexity, elegant simplicity, delivering capabilities rather than just features, and for me, especially conceptual integrity.
And in the middle of all this, as I keep repeating, there's human beings. So consciously making and taking architectural decisions, right? And these decisions are how we shape our software, responding to the feedback that we're opening ourselves up to. It's how our systems evolve and how the systems try and find their natural balance. And so for the avoidance of doubt, I want to quickly define what I mean by architectural decision a little more closely. And this is actually what Diana and I mean, because one of the things we did spend a lot of time trying to make sure we agreed on when we wrote this was we wanted to emphasize what we have different, but we wanted to be clear about what we thought was the same. And what we ended up with was this Michael Nygaard quote. So Michael Nygaard's take on things, as it says here, is an architecturally significant decision is one which affects the structure, non-functional characteristics, dependencies, interfaces, or construction technology. And to me, this is really nice because it talks about the impacts of all points of the delivery and therefore the entire feedback cycle, right? But also, it says nothing about the scale of the decision. It doesn't, only apply to big, hairy decisions that's taken by a very senior person. It could equally apply to a tiny decision which someone makes by accident and doesn't even realize is going to have a 7-year impact and multi-billion pound, cost, like adding nulls to C++, for example. And so therefore, remember, today we're looking at multiple levels. We're looking at individual, intra-team, inter-team. And given Nygaard's definition, I want to take one step forward. What I want to do is become more aware of and highlight, perhaps, because I think it's the root cause of lots of my nightmares, is the impact of unintended consequences of my decisions and unintended consequences of all of our decisions. Because as we keep saying, systems that we're working with are chaotic and are emergent. That means for any decision that we take, even if the scope of impact might be relatively obvious, the nature of that scope is far more opaque, which means it's impossible to control the outcomes of what we do 100%, despite the fact that a lot of us get into software engineering thinking that we can. So therefore, again, I come back to my idea of using small iterations, small feedbacks, and small decisions to let us know sooner what a change might have set in motion.
That when Andrew had said this is impossible to control outcomes 100%, it was just banging around in my brain. Impossible to control 100% because there's a collision there. Often initiatives, especially when they're very expensive, there's a desire to control them 100%. But in fact, we aren't trying to maintain control, we're trying to maintain conceptual integrity. And that is not the same thing. And we want to enable parts of the system to hang together and form a cohesive whole, even as they play independent roles. So more like an orchestra. And we want the parts together to do things that the parts alone could not have done, right? So that's the definition of emergence. And emergence is what we hope to be designing for, right? So for me, an architectural decision is about relationships, patterns, or paradigm. So when we're transforming relationships between the parts, especially if we're changing how and when those parts communicate, or when we're trying different patterns. So we're asking software to change patterns. So decoupling, for example, is very common in my world. Or when the mission or the circumstances in which the system operates has changed. So it's a paradigm shift. So for example, a lot happened during the pandemic that shifted the paradigm in which software was operating from the outside in. So these are technical and product decisions, technical and user decisions, and business strategy. So the full stack. And so there we go. That's what full stack means now. It's the full stack facilitator of thinking. And so my favorite quote that sums this up is the Donella Meadows, you think that because you understand one, that you must therefore understand two, because one and one make two, but you forget that you must also understand and. And I would argue that architecture is mostly the art and science of and.
And so you can hear us both saying that there's definitely no absolute answers. And I don't think anyone here thinks there is. Someone I've already seen on chat is talking about there's being no silver bullet. And there's no hard and fast rules, right? If you're looking for those, systems architecture is guaranteed to suck for you. But there are, however, some well-structured processes that at least Diana and I've discovered that work well for thinking together. And it's one of these that we'd like to share with you now. So Diana's kind of going to go a bit meta, and then I'm going to go very boring and specific. But hopefully we'll leave you with something, and then a few lessons learned, and then we can kind of step out of the way, and Tobias can introduce the open space. But that's what we're going to do now.
So Andrew called this the architectural advice process before we had even started. And speaking of vocabulary and emergent vocabulary, I tripped over the word advice. I had a lot, it's kind of a loaded phrase for me. So first thing we start by defining exactly what we mean. And the literal definition is what we mean. And that is guidance or recommendations offered with regard to prudent future action. So being able to offer recommendations in a particular, relevant to a particular circumstance. What we do not mean is opinion giving. And in my experience in architectural situations, this is what I get most of the time is people's opinions. And so we really want to be able to highlight today too, the difference between opinion giving and the advice process.
Yeah, so please bear that in mind, because I may in the past have been an opinion giver, and it definitely sucks. So with that in mind, this is the advice process. This the whole thing that all of this has kind of come from is fitted on this single slide, but there's a lot packed into it. So number one, any part of the advice process is anyone can make any decision, which means literally anyone can make a decision. But before doing so, they must do two things. Number one, seek advice from all affected parties, and seek advice from people with expertise in the matter. And this is where it's important that Diana's qualified advice, because seeking advice doesn't mean you need to listen to that advice, but you do need to go and seek that information from people.
So Andrew's going to go deeper into what it is that he means by this, or exactly how he envisions the process. But I do a whoa when we start, because what I find is missing a lot is the individual and foundational skills that we need in order to participate in the process. We're going to be practicing proactive engagement, and that actually requires some skills that we need to develop for ourselves. And so there are three foundational skills that I'm suggesting here. And the first one is metacognition, or self-awareness, the ability to think about thinking and directing your own learning, that you're actually able to assess the patterns and quality of thinking as a process, not just the content of the thinking itself. The second is the ability to respond rather than react. So there's a lot of drama and a lot of blame in a lot of cultures, and we're a big no culture. Somebody is wrong and I must tell them. And instead, we need to cultivate the ability to construct responses instead of reactions, right? To be able to acknowledge what's being said and add to it in some sort of meaningful, helpful way. And then the third one is the practice of systemic reasoning. And so this is where instead of giving your opinion, you share your thinking. You share the reasons that convinced you that this action or idea or theory is a good one, so that other people can respond to that, as opposed to a she said, he said, she said type of experience. So we also practice these skills with others, right? So as Andrew's going to describe it next, so bonus points if you help other people strengthen their ability to do systemic reasoning. And so the way that my primary definition to describe this practice is it's the ability to synthesize knowledge, experience, and sound judgment, yours and other people's knowledge, experience, and sound judgment into decisions based on valid reasons.
And so I just posted in chat that that's I think about this stuff that Diana's just shared over and over again, because I think it does supercharge, irrespective of the advice process or not, it supercharges my practice of architecture. So I definitely advise people think about it a bit. But as Diana said, what I'm now we'll close off with, or set penultimately close with, is a kind of example of how this works. Because at the core of the advice process as an approach is a mutual agreement. So it's a contract, if you want to think technically, right? And that contract is we, as people who are following it as a part of a collective, we trust others to make decisions because we don't necessarily have the power to control them, right? On the understanding that they put in the hard work, which is the two kind of addendums to the advice process point, and they think, and that people think about their decisions' impact on everyone and everything else. So because remember, everyone can make a decision with the advice process, each of us is likely to play different roles in this agreement, depending on where the decision arises from. So let's consider those roles for a minute or two, looking from a few angles to get a feel of the architectural advice process working. So first come those with the point of need, right? They're the ones who've spotted something significant and desire to take an architectural decision to action it. For example, a team wants to move to trunk-based continuous delivery and are proposing a form of release toggle. Simple Boolean checks in code, right? So not a big decision, but a pretty important, impactful one. In most circumstances, this person, or typically a team, right, have loads of specific, local, and up-to-the-minute details. They are very now focused because this issue is blocking them, so this is why they want to take this decision. Then come the affected parties. They're typically peers in other delivery teams who will have their lives changed, which means they'll have extra work to do or have their freedom and flexibility curtailed as a consequence of the decision that this first team is making. Their outside in, but still here and now perspective is incredibly useful. It provides really valuable context to people trying to make a decision. In our example, this might be another team developing against features which are be toggled off. So if they're toggled off, how can we see them to test against, right? They won't be in the test environment anymore because they'll be hidden. Third come those with expertise, which usually translates to past experience and or wider horizons on the decision. And these horizons might be longer time periods, broader scopes, greater risk awareness, deeper understanding of cost implications, wider understanding of the impact on people and the skills in other areas of the organization, as well as general organizational, business, market, and industry understanding. Returning to our example, this could be someone who remembers all the dead code that was left in the code base last time someone tried this after reading a blog post on Martin Fowler's wiki, right? Or a QA lead who points out that this might make certain types of testing harder because now we've got to test all the code paths with the toggle on and test with the toggle off. So it's not a free decision. With this simple example, we can see the architectural advice process providing a basis for combining a wide variety of data and viewpoints, near and long term, local and system wide, upstream and downstream. It's a really powerful mix. But there's a final aspect which makes things really powerful. When the team takes their decision, as I said a minute ago, they are under no obligation in this approach to adhere to any piece of advice. They can ignore it all if they like. This flips the traditional dynamic where previously decisions were taken outside teams and handed to them to implement on its head. Now with the advice process, teams have a stronger voice and are exposed directly to their peers and the consequences of their decisions, right? They're the people who are responsible. But what about those needs for cross-cutting decisions, the things that Diana's mentioned and has tackled so many times in her career? Decisions that arise from the nature and direction of the system as a whole. Decisions which Diana described so eloquently earlier. Who raises those in the architecture advice process? Well, they inevitably come from people who play roles outside of a single delivery team. The experts, traditionally, or experts in inverted commas. Roles we typically think of these days in lots of our organizations as architecture or architects. The dynamic is different here. By following the architectural advice process, those concerned with the overall systemic architecture have a mechanism now to work out in the open, to establish a dialogue, and build trust and understanding across all teams within the socio-technical system. And this, for me, is where the real power of the advice process comes in. The architect has to recognize that they are dependent upon teams to deliver the necessary change. There is, they can make a decision, but they still need to wait for the teams to put that into code. They must listen to those teams as part of their contract, which is a great way to get right now detail, which is frequently something that's very hard to get, who's someone playing an architecture role, and make coherent arguments for the benefits of the change. This is a real balancing effect and can really fine-tune decisions.
And so we have one little piece here of what could possibly go wrong, because we've said like nice, wonderful things about how this could really work. But that this is the real world. And I want to acknowledge time. We started a little bit later. It's 1:30 and time for us to dive into learning how to make this work. So I think we'll go through I think we'll still do this. It'll only take us a minute or two, Andrew. Yeah, it will do this, take a minute or two, and then we're going to get into the real fun stuff where Tobias is going to teach us how to do this, and then we get to go listen to all what everyone here is here to talk about and think about. And so the way that most of what Andrew described in the advice process, it describes exactly when digital transformations, architectural experiences have gone really well. But what goes wrong? And there's infinite answers to this. And I'm sure today I'm going to learn about new ones. From my own experience, here are some of the leading challenges. One is that people just say, this is an architecture. We're not talking about Kubernetes. I'm not interested. This is an architecture. Another is that I make a recommendation and I get basically the nothing Jon Snow syndrome, where people just don't engage in what other people are thinking. Establishing and maintaining trust, right? That's a big one. I need to be trustworthy, and sometimes I'm wrong. We need to trust each other, but with discernment, and we aren't very good at either of that. Like, that's just not something that we're generally good at. Emotional labor. There's a lot of drama in tech, and that people who don't think they're emotional are often the ones who require the most attention. So I do not think that we handle the amount of emotional labor or recognize the emotional labor well. Playing a glue role or a cat herder role. This is kind of where people organizations put a system person to hold things together that don't want to stay together. My professional rule now is nobody gets to be a cat. It's not anybody's job to hold people together because no one gets to be a cat. The way we maintain power and control. I mean, we could talk about this all day. The trickle-down strategic leadership and management that's more parental, integrative, gets in the way of this process. And then also you end up having people in charge who don't think well together and aren't good at facilitating thinking well together, that we don't think of that as the skill that you have to have. And I'm not suggesting we get rid of all hierarchy. I do think that organizational hierarchy, to some extent, like in the US, the federal versus the state government, some of that is at good operational. But I do think that we have to shift the default paradigm even to correctly define the word and understand how to support. So Andrew, go wrong?
Oh, sorry, I thought I was on mute, but I wasn't on mute. So yeah, those are all super relevant and things that I recognize. I wrote a blog post about this, so if people want to read more, and on part of that I shared a bunch of failure patterns. So it's called Scaling the Practice of Architecture Conversationally. But the one I wanted to point out here is, I said before, the size of a decision can make a massive impact, and we tend to default to making big decisions, just like in the old days when we tend towards implementing large features, as opposed to now realizing that we can break them down. And this comes back to my feedback loop as well. So things I've discovered that work really nicely are, if you want to track how things are working with the advice process, if you track the number of decisions you're making and the frequency, like how long a decision takes to make, how many decisions you make over a certain time period, how frequently those decisions turn out to be wrong, and how rapidly you can back them out or replace them with a better decision. Those metrics are amazing to track. And if you're thinking those sound a lot like the 4-key metrics, DORA 4-key metrics, but for decisions, you're exactly right. I've used this a bunch of times, and it's really, really nice to help you figure out a way to, again, get into the feedback loops and start writing stuff. So it works really well. So there's a load of stuff you can do wrong, but if you keep track of those, just like with the DORA 4-key metrics, it's a nice way of keeping focused. And that's it.
Great. So I'm so excited to look in the chat. I'm seeing things now that we're at the end, and I want to go through it. But we thank you for. I'm so excited to joining your sessions today, and now we're gonna learn how we're gonna move forward. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Diana and Andrew.